Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Nellie Salagi-Benedek, and I'm the Deputy Director of Education and Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's James L. Weinberg Distinguished Lecture entitled Diaspora Tales and Rembrandt, which will be presented by Professor Larry Silver. The James L. Weinberg Distinguished Lecture is made possible by the Marshall M. Weinberg Fund with additional support from Marshall M. Weinberg. We are very grateful for this generous support. Tonight's talk is held in conjunction with the exhibition, The Book of Esther in the Age of Rembrandt, on view on this floor through August 10th. There is still a number of related programs coming up, including a concert featuring music of the Sephardic Baroque on Sunday, May 4th, a conversation with curator Abigail Rappaport and Rabbi Meyer Soloveitchik on Wednesday, May 21st, and a panel discussion on depictions of biblical women on Thursday, May 29th. For information about all our events, please visit our website, and you can sign up for our e-news. Now, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker. Larry Silver is the Farquhar Professor of Art History Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania. He previously taught at Berkeley and Northwestern. A specialist in painting and graphics of the Netherlands and Germany, he has published or co-authored monographs on a number of leading artists: Bosch, Bruegel, Dürer, Rembrandt, and Rubens and Velázquez. He also authored studies on the printed publicity of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and on the rise of pictorial genres in 16th century Antwerp. His two most recent books are Europe Views the World, 1500 to 1700, and Art and Disillusion in the Long 16th Century. Professor Silver has co-curated two significant print exhibitions, one on the rise of professional engravers in the Low Countries, and the other on monumental prints in the age of Dürer and Titian. He has served as president of the Historians of Netherlandish Art and of the College Art Association, where he created and served as editor-in-chief of CAA Reviews Online. Now, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Larry Silver.
Well, let me start by expressing my gratitude to the Jewish Museum and curator Abigail Rappaport for this incredible exhibition, and to the Weinbergs for sponsoring this lecture. And let me wish those who are celebrating a Hag Sameach, a sweet Passover. And thank you for coming out if you aren't still koshering your house. This wonderful Jewish Museum exhibition reminds us of the importance of the Book of Esther for the Jews of Rembrandt's time as an endangered minority culture, strangers in a strange land during their stay in Persia. While their story has a happy ending like a Shakespearean comedy that reverses all dangers in the final act, this is still a dark comedy of real threats to the entire Jewish people. Scholars have dated the Book of Esther among the latest contributions to the Tanakh, possibly even during the Hellenistic period, in part because of its use of late biblical Hebrew, but also because of its Persian setting. So historically, it emerges after the fall of Jerusalem to the forces of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia in 587 CE. Another striking element of the Megillat is that the name of God is never mentioned, and the salvation of the Jewish people from utter destruction is left up to them through the agency of Mordecai and Esther. Now, we know that Rembrandt was a close reader of the Hebrew Bible, which after 1637 had appeared in a new Dutch translation from the Hebrew called the Statenbijbel, or States Bible, which is on view in the exhibition. And it's equivalent to the contemporary translation in England, which we know as the King James Bible. Today, I'd like to turn to two other texts about the Jewish experience in Persia, some of which have been consigned to leftover elements of the Apocrypha, though they were clearly very well known to Rembrandt, who made images of their events and visions. Both stories also have happy endings and offer the promise of a renewed future back in Jerusalem. One of them, which was a favorite of Rembrandt, you might never even have heard of. It's called the Book of Tobit. The other one in a text which is both canonical and apocryphal is the Book of Daniel. Especially in the case of Daniel, its final vision brought Rembrandt into direct contact with a leading rabbi of the Amsterdam Jewish community, the ecumenical Manasseh ben Israel, one publication of which is also in the exhibition. Now, please allow me a minute, because it's an unfamiliar plot, to tell you the story of the Book of Tobit. Authorized for inclusion in the Stoughton Bible already in 1618, the Book of Tobit was not included in the Tanakh because the only potentially canonical versions of the text that survived are fragments in both Hebrew and Aramaic found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the last century. However, the text did exist in a Greek version, part of the 70-part translations from Hebrew compiled by Jewish scholars in Egypt, known as the Septuagint. And it was often consulted by Christians throughout the Middle Ages and eventually became part of the Catholic Bible. And you'll know some of the other Septuagint Apocrypha. You certainly know the Book of Judith, and you probably know the Wisdom of Solomon, and there are others as well. So the Book of Tobit's origins are similar to the Book of Esther in its Persian setting, its late historical setting within Jewish history. And it occurs during the Jewish exile, which is usually known as the Babylonian captivity. Unlike the Book of Esther, however, Tobit is a family drama of two generations. A pious, elderly Jewish man named Tobit lives in exile in Nineveh after the Assyrians have taken him prisoner. So the story takes place around 722 BCE. However, he contacts a corpse, and that defiles him, in spite of the fact that it was a co-religionist, and he suffers blindness. And because of those misfortunes, he begs the Lord to let him die. But he sends his own son, Tobias, to Media to fetch money that he'd left there. Back in Media, there's a young woman named Sarah who also prays for death, because she's lost 7 husbands who are each killed alongside her on their wedding night by a vengeful demon. Well, God hears the prayers of both Tobit and Sarah, and he sends an archangel, Raphael, in human form with a disguised name, they don't recognize him, to aid both Sarah and Tobit. Now, Raphael travels to Media with Tobias, the son. And when the young man is attacked by a large fish as he bathes in the Tigris River, Raphael orders him to grab it and remove its gall, heart, and liver as sources for medicine, I guess like cod liver oil of the old days. Later, at Raphael's urging, Tobias marries Sarah, and he uses the fish's heart and liver to drive that demon from their bridal chambers, so they survive that test. Returning to Nineveh with his new wife and his father's money, Tobias cures Tobit's blindness. He rubs the fish's gall into his father's eyes. And finally, Raphael reveals his true identity, and he rises dramatically upward to return to heaven. Tobit then utters a beautiful hymn of praise before he dies, and he tells his son to leave Nineveh because God will destroy that wicked city. Nineveh, of course, is also picked up in the book of Jonah, and Jonah's name is actually mentioned by Tobit, who declares that, and I quote, "I surely believe those things which Jonah the prophet speaks of Nineveh, that it shall be overthrown," end quote. So Tobit goes on to offer the prophecy of a restoration of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. Here's what he says: God will have mercy on them and bring them again into the land where they'll build a temple, but not like the first one, until the time of that age be fulfilled. And afterward they shall return from all places of their captivity and build up Jerusalem gloriously, and the house of God shall be built in it forever with a glorious building, as the prophets have spoken thereof, end quote. So it's really a very optimistic and future-oriented ending. Now, Rembrandt was not the first artist to focus on the Tobit story. Early in the 17th century, a German artist in Rome named Adam Elsheimer depicted Tobit and the disguised angel Raphael on the trail, twice in colorful small paintings on copper. But I'm not showing you the paintings, I'm showing you how the imagery by Elsheimer was transmitted back to the Netherlands in this pair of beautiful engravings after Elsheimer by his Dutch friend and admirer, Hendrik Gout. In both versions of the story, we as viewers realize that Raphael is a winged angel, though Tobias sees him only as a traveling companion. In the early 1630s, a Haarlem printmaker whom Rembrandt greatly admired, named Hercules Zegers, made his own etched version of the pair on foot. He sets the figures in one of his typical grainy landscapes. Now we know that Rembrandt knew that print. He got the etched copper plate, but he revised it by eliminating the figures and made a Holy Family on the flight into Egypt. However, once more, Zegers shows Raphael acting in the role of a guardian angel, closely following at the side of Tobias to protect and to advise him. Now, you may wonder whether there's a Jewish source for guardian angels, and they are mentioned several times in Psalms. At Psalm 91, we hear, "For he will give his angels charge of you, to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up." Or Psalm 34, "The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them." Now, while many of Rembrandt's Tobit images focus on the father figure of blind but pious Tobit and his wife Anna, the textual narrative centers on this divinely sanctioned journey by Tobias under the protection of the archangel Raphael. Now, Rembrandt never really did show Tobias and Raphael in transit except in his drawings, which I'm not going to show you, but he returned several times to images of Tobias frightened by the great fish. Rembrandt's teacher in Amsterdam, Peter Lostman, depicted the wedding night of Tobias and Sarah in this painting of 1611, which is now in Boston, so nearby. And there the popular motif of a candle which lights a dark room was imported from Italy by Elsheimer and by Lostman. It's really a 17th century, early 17th century Roman trick. And it shows Raphael burning the fish organs while a presumably invisible Raphael is strangling the serpent-like demon in the air beside the canopy of the wedding bed. Here's the strangulation up here. And here's the burning of the fish gall. And Sarah looks like she's all ready. A good index of Rembrandt's stylistic development as a painter is his later version of the same subject from around 1645, which is now in Berlin. Oh, wait a minute, I've skipped something. One of Rembrandt's earliest paintings is this work of 1626, now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And it's a moment where Anna comes back with a goat, because in those days there was a lot of barter instead of just money being exchanged for the kind of work she did. And Tobit, in his cynical way, thinks she's stolen it, and he upbraids her for that, and they have a big marital quarrel. And Rembrandt has realized that here. Yeah, I think you can make out that he's showing Tobit as a blind old man. And here's how Rembrandt shows the same subject later in his career in this work of around 1645, now in Berlin. It's now much more tonal in a limited palette and far more interested in the modest surroundings of the couple in their hovel. Here, Tobit's gesture seems to be the moment just before he chews out his faithful, when he does chew out his faithful spouse, and here is the goat in the lower corner. But he self-righteously is still accusing her of theft. Another early image by Rembrandt of the couple's relationship dates to around 1630 in London's National Gallery. And here both figures are seated in repose. Tobit almost seems to be sleeping. It's rather dark in this slide, I'm afraid. He's worn down by his condition. Anna is working at her domestic task of spinning, often associated in Dutch culture with female virtue in the gendered world of household Dutch duties. And Rembrandt repeated this same figural composition at a rather late work of 1659, now in Rotterdam. Once more, he emphasizes their surroundings in this one-room cottage warmed by a fire. The moment of this scene in the story is not specified, but it could depict the couple's long wait for the return of their son Tobias from what turned out to be an 8-year journey, according to the text. But then Tobias comes back. And when he hears the approach of his son, blind Tobit stumbles awkwardly to the door in this early version by Rembrandt of this part of the story. This large painting in a private collection was probably painted by Rembrandt, but he may have worked with a talented pupil from Leiden named Gerard Douw. The picture shows Tobit stumbling over Anna's spinning wheel as he hurries to the door to greet his son, and you can see the angel silhouetted outside the door. So they're coming back, and he hears them in his blindness, but stumbles to the door. A pair of etchings also shows the same awkward moment with Rembrandt's varied mastery of the medium of etching. At the left, we see the earlier version, a small print from around 1629, and here Tobit is reaching out for the darkened doorway with his hands because he's blind. On the right, we see a larger plate of 1651, which is even more emphatic and expressly devoted to Tobit as a subject. Like the painting, we see him stumbling over Anna's spinning wheel as he reaches for the doorway. And he misses it. He's about to trip over a small spaniel in his path. He's truly a blind man. His darkened eye sockets and his walking stick further underscore Tobit's blindness. And we see what he does not. We see his own shadow on the entry wall. Once more, Rembrandt expands his viewpoint to take in the cottage room with its fireplace and its drying fish, but now he's using the black and white of the print medium of etching. Unlike other artists, Rembrandt also painted a small panel now in Stuttgart in Germany, and I'm sorry for the out-of-focus right slide, but I thought you might want to see a little more closely what's going on here. This is the healing process. We once again see small figures filling the humble interior space, and light streams in through an open window at the left as Tobias, who wears a turban to suggest the biblical location that Rembrandt assigns to ancient Assyria. Tobias is rubbing that healing gall in his father's eyes, although he looks more like a careful surgeon. Aged Anna is looking on at the procedure. That's what we call operations now, procedures. Along with winged Raphael, who is dressed in white robes, but still is revealed as an angel to those of us who can see that, but only to us viewers. Rembrandt also depicted this healing scene in as many as 7 different drawings across his career. But the dramatic climax of the Tobias story, chapter 12 of the Book of Tobit, occurs after Tobias has headlined Tobit's blindness and healed him. And it's the moment when the angel reveals himself to Tobit's entire family and then disappears in flight. What you see on the screen is Peter Lastman again, Rembrandt's teacher from Amsterdam. And he painted this scene in a 1618 painting in Copenhagen. And here the angel still hovers outdoors above the kneeling figures of both Tobit and Tobias. This scene fascinated Rembrandt. He took it up in both a painting and an etching. But significantly, in the 2 main versions by Rembrandt, the revelation of his angelic identity by Raphael is staged dramatically at the threshold of the house, with the entire family present, although the text only speaks about father and son. So once again, Rembrandt is making a family drama out of something that wasn't expressly that in the original text. Raphael exhorts them to piety and to praise of God and righteous works, but then he declares that he will always be with them, or he was always with them. He was sent by God to heal Tobit's blindness in his true identity as a guardian angel within the divine plan. But then suddenly he disappears. On the left, you see Rembrandt's 1637 painting of this in the Louvre in Paris. Both men are kneeling. Tobit falls to the ground and looks down. His son Tobias looks up. And I think I have a slide that shows it in isolation. And Tobias is watching the flight of the angel while offering a rather theatrical gesture of astonishment, typical of early Rembrandt. Let me show you the larger slide of that. Their wives are there too, and they react in similar ways. Anna is above Tobias. Here she is. And she shrinks back and can't look, while Sarah is clasping her hands in prayer, and she follows the angel with her gaze. We have a terrified small dog here who is cowering at their feet, and Rembrandt's angel here is seen from below and behind, dramatically foreshortened. Though he still has prominent wings, he's rising upward on a cloud, and this figure is one of Rembrandt's most successful suggestions of a full angelic body that nevertheless could suspend itself in air and engage in actual flight. Sometimes his angels look like they're a little weighted down. Let me go back to the double slide so you can see the etching in relation to the painting 4 years later in 1641, and I have a separate slide of that as well. So I'll go to that now. This retains the presence of Tobit's full family at the threshold, but it shows the angel disappearing above the upper frame of the image. Only his feet and midsection are visible here, and he really looks like he's barely gotten off, like some of the airplanes that we sometimes worry about. Divine light is streaming down from beyond him as he rises on clouds, here specifically coming out of a brazier on the ground, and you see the light rays coming down. So this smoke has an earthly rather than a supernatural origin. It's not a cloud. In this enactment, both men are kneeling in prayer, but this time, however, Tobit is the more composed and calm figure. Tobias instead seems deeply moved by the revelation. So here's young Tobias. He averts his eyes. Aged Anna is standing upright now, silhouetted before the doorway, looking at the spot whence the angel last stood on earth. But the younger woman, Sarah, is now cowering behind her husband, Tobias. Rembrandt's rearranged the reactions, rethought the picture. Her hands are upraised in both surprise and fear. And there are now numerous servants who crowd the scene, and the little dog is actually kind of preoccupied. He's turned inward. Rembrandt doesn't forget dogs in his images. This etching adheres more closely to the Tobit text because it places in the right foreground a treasure that Tobit had intended to give in thanks to Raphael. Here it is. That's the money that Tobias brought back from Media. It still stands beside the pack mule that brought it home, so this scene occurs shortly after Tobias and Raphael have arrived. We might well ask, why did Rembrandt have such a fascination with the Book of Tobit, since it wasn't canonical for so long? Well, he might have had a non-biblical motivation. Julius Held asserted in the first article devoted to Rembrandt and the Book of Tobit that the theme of blindness occurs frequently in his work. For example, he shows the ancient Dutch revolutionary against Rome, Claudius Civilis, with a missing eye. And his most horrific painting features the blinding of Samson. Excuse me. Two of his later paintings depict blind Homer. And Rembrandt drew and etched blind beggars. So though the evidence is scant, Held argues that Rembrandt's own father might even have been blind. But for Rembrandt, I want to suggest that the larger significance of the Book of Tobit lay beyond the motif of blindness. Like Esther, Tobit evokes a historical period of exile, and its brief text combines prayers, especially that moving hymn of redemption at the end that I mentioned from Tobit's own words, along with its adventure elements on the road, kind of a Bing Crosby idea, and the importance of piety and morality practiced by the faithful is always present. The book offers teachings about guardian angels and filial piety, about almsgiving, and even reverence for the dead. It has a happy ending, and it provides a dramatic climax, this moment when Raphael reveals himself and then departs. But for the artist, the book's moving situation about the plight in the life of a diaspora community in exile echoes the wider social condition of the Book of Esther, which is why I brought it in tonight. And it would have provided individual comfort from its repeated message about true faith, where God tests his people but hears their prayers and redeems them in the end. The promise of a return to Jerusalem and a rebuilt Second Temple looms over the Book of Tobit and offers an antidote to the despair that Rembrandt once painted in an early 1630 picture, now in Amsterdam, where Jeremiah laments the destruction of Jerusalem. Regarding Dutch sympathy for the restoration of the Jerusalem temple, in 1611, Lostman, Rembrandt's teacher, had designed a now lost stained glass painting with the theme where Persian King Cyrus returns the treasures of the temple. And I'm showing you on the left its design drawing, which survives in Berlin, even though the stained glass is gone. But that composition was actually replicated in a painting in 1660 by Thomas de Keyser, which shows the fulfillment of Tobit's prophecy. Oops, I'm sorry. You see Cyrus here. You see the idea of the Jerusalem temple, which looks a lot like St. Peter's in Rome, but okay. That's the contemporary model. And this is the world that fulfills the prophecy when Cyrus allows the Jews to return and to rebuild the temple. So let's return again to the remaining diaspora story, the latest in the Tanakh, the Book of Daniel, another 2nd century BCE text whose historical period is situated in the 6th century under this ruler, Cyrus the Great. Despite being part of the Tanakh, it received its fullest text in the Septuagint in Egypt, with some later parts that are excluded from the contemporary Jewish Bible. Chapters 1 through 6 involve Daniel, like Joseph, as a favored court figure. And he's even a little bit like the combination of Esther with Mordecai in their individual ways. But the remaining chapters, 7 through 12, convey apocalyptic visions revealed to the prophet, where Daniel is like the other forecasters of the future and the return. Already in 1633, and it's in the exhibition, it's hard to see in this slide, it's a small picture, as you see in the galleries, now at the Getty Museum, where Daniel and Cyrus appear before the giant idol of Bel. And you can barely make it out in this slide, I apologize. But you can see it, it's here. The story, which ridicules the worship of idols, goes as follows. Daniel is already esteemed by Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire, and he challenges his courtier to explain how the sculpture of Bel must be alive since it consumes daily portions of food and drink, like Santa Claus. Daniel responds that the idol is made of clay and brass, so it cannot eat or drink. And in response, the priests who serve the idol of Bel as their living demand that the king set out the usual offerings and then seal the temple entrance. Whoever misled the king would then run the risk of a death penalty. But Daniel exposes the ruse of those priests by scattering ashes over the floor of the temple after the priests have left, supposedly, so that he can show that the sacred offerings of Bel, like Santa's cookies, are actually consumed at night by the priests coming in by a secret door. Next morning, when the king comes to inspect his test, he sees that the food has been consumed, despite the unbroken seals on the door, but Daniel reveals the priests' footprints on the temple floor. So the priests are arrested, and Daniel is permitted to destroy both the idol and the temple of Bel. This is the subject that Rembrandt painted with the central crowned Cyrus with his turban. Rembrandt loved turbans and Eastern, what we would once have called Oriental imagery. And he has a golden mantle in the lighted central position. Daniel is a young man. He bows in homage from the shadowy margin in response to his monarch's challenge. Here he is. A royal Cyrus at the center extends his scepter toward the table where the offerings are placed on a carpeted table under the looming giant statue of the idol. Bel's priests are very dimly visible in the shadowed lower left corner, and you can't see them at all in this slide, unfortunately, indicating their nefarious secret practices. Certainly for Rembrandt, this choice of subject appealed because of its affirmation of monotheism, as well as the chance to show off his evocation of bygone biblical time and Persian location through the costume. This painting also shows his close, thorough reading of the Bible, including Apocrypha, which we've already encountered in his continuing fascination with the Tobit story. Daniel's favoritism at court for his wisdom and visions already began in the first chapter after the conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And divine visions allow him to interpret the king's troubling dreams, just like Joseph. Daniel speaks of a golden image, but with feet of clay and iron, like the idol of Bel. It represents 4 kingdoms, only to be broken by a stone cut from a mountain without human hands, as a prophecy of the downfall of that kingdom, giving way to God's eternal kingdom. In chapter 5, the king's son, Belshazzar, holds a great feast where he profanes the sacred vessels of the former temple, only to see an unreadable message on the wall written by a moving hand, the fiery finger. Daniel successfully deciphers the writing and declares that it comes as a divine warning about Belshazzar's downfall due to pride. That night, Belshazzar was slain and his kingdom overtaken by Darius the Mede. Now, Rembrandt certainly appreciated the drama of the fiery finger's wall posting. In an undated painting from around the mid-1630s in the National Gallery in London, he provided the poster child for the lecture. The horror-stricken Belshazzar recoils in fear from the Hebrew letters that he beholds. This form of angelic intervention confronts the unbelieving sinner with a written warning, consonant with the Jewish tradition of representing the divine in art only through a hand that appears out of heaven. I think you can see that, but there it is, out of a cloud. Rembrandt's painting, Belshazzar's Feast, presents the warning as literally written on the wall. And Daniel read it. Here's the translation. "You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." Rembrandt's supernatural inscription glows, seemingly hovering in midair, with the inscribing detached hand surrounded by clouds. The large sinful monarch at center wears a towering turban topped by a crown with an elaborate brocade cloak over a jeweled golden chain. The divine decree as a disembodied hand contrasts with his venial earthly sin and his material sumptuous body. Why couldn't the sages of Babylon not read the message? It's in perfectly legible Hebrew letters that Rembrandt got some help with, obviously. An answer to that question was proffered by Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel in Amsterdam a few years later in a book that he published in 1639 called De Termino Vitae, on the ends of life. There he claims that the reason why these accurately rendered Hebrew letters could not be read as mene el tekel ufarsin was because they read not from right to left like proper Hebrew, but instead vertically, downward from the right edge. Mene tekel ufarsin. And they haven't quite put the final nun there. Some people have tried to say Rembrandt didn't get it right because he didn't finish the final nun, but the hand is still writing. So I don't know what they're talking about. And for this explanation and for these carefully delineated letters, Rembrandt almost certainly had recourse to expert consultation with this Amsterdam rabbinical neighbor, Manasseh ben Israel. 2 decades later, the paths of Rembrandt and Manasseh crossed again. The rabbi published a messianic book in 1655 called the Piedra Gloriosa, the glorious stone, or on the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. In that work, he finds various biblical moments when stones play a decisive role in the Hebrew Bible. The more obvious ones are the stone that David uses to slay Goliath, and the stone where Jacob laid his head at Bethel and dreamed of those angels ascending and descending on a ladder to heaven. But Manasseh turns to Daniel chapter 3 for the stone that destroys the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the rabbi finds messianic elements in Daniel's dream interpretations. The stone that crushes the king's statue, he says, represents the Messiah who will be sent by God and who will sweep away all the other empires of the world, becoming a 4th monarchy. Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, to be replaced by God with the eternal 5th monarchy, Israel. From a vision in Daniel chapter 7, which is not in the Hebrew Bible, Manasseh furthers his interpretation. The prophet describes how he saw, and I quote, "a great sea churned up by the four winds of heaven and four huge beasts coming out of the sea. Those beasts were a lion with eagle's wings, a bear, a four-headed leopard with four bird wings, and another terrifying fourth beast." And here's the line: "dreadful and grisly, exceedingly strong, with great iron teeth and bronze claws, plus 10 horns, plus another one which spoke." It's worse than where the wild things are. When this final beast was killed and cremated, Daniel says that he, quote, "saw one like a man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient in years and was presented to him, and sovereignty and glory and kingly power were given to him, so that all people and nations of every language should serve him. His sovereignty was to be an everlasting sovereignty, which should not pass away, and his kingly power such as should never be impaired." End of quote. Manasseh interprets Daniel's vision of the four beasts as those same four doomed kingdoms, with the final beast as the most evil and dominant. And the man coming down from heaven would be the Messiah, whose fifth kingdom will be everlasting, worldly dominion, the monarchy of Israel. Around 1650, it's awful dark, sorry, Rembrandt, or a close associate, and there's some dispute over this, painted an image of the vision of Daniel, explained from a great height by the archangel Gabriel, according to Daniel chapter 8. And here the prophet recounts another vision with a mighty ram overcome by a goat with a single horn that enlarges and undermines temple rituals, both daily sacrifices and a desecrated sanctuary. You can actually barely see it, but the goat is over here. Gabriel informs Daniel that the ram represents the Medes and Persians, the goat is Greece, and his little horn is a wicked king. The message of this end-time vision is akin to the concluding New Testament book of Revelation, or Apocalypse. And this painting, now in Berlin, was considerably reworked by Joshua Reynolds in the late 18th century, so its attribution remains uncertain, but it is clearly connected to Daniel's vision in chapter 8. We can't know what inspired the artist to paint such an unusual subject, but what is certain, that another half-decade later, Rembrandt would collaborate with Manasseh himself, producing 4 small etching illustrations for the 1655 publication of the Piedra Gloriosa. That set of etchings conforms closely to the 4 instances of stones in the Hebrew Bible that we've mentioned already. At the lower right, David and Goliath. That's the easy one. At the lower left, Jacob's dream. Hard to read, but here's sleeping Jacob, and the angels are going up and down the ladder. Upper left is Rembrandt's interpretation of the gold statue with brass and clay feet from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And finally, at the upper right, we have the mysterious encounter of the Ancient of Days in heaven above the 4 beasts. You can see them down here. Of a messianic Son of Man whose kingdom over the entire world will be everlasting. Let me show you those two, and you can make out there's a figure of God here blessing this figure that will be the Messiah, and here are the very weird 4 beasts down below, with Rembrandt's happy signature all over the place. It should be noted that Manasseh was a kind of intermediary in this period between the Amsterdam Jewish community and Christian theologians in both Holland and England, who were anticipating an imminent arrival of the second coming of Christ around 1656, although some people with different editions came up with 1666. But there was a lot of messianic fervor. Manasseh shared it a bit and probably abetted it for those Christian theologians. Another curious detail is that in a pair of surviving books, simpler engravings were used in place of Rembrandt's original etching illustrations. And I should say all of these are rather small, about the size, a little bit bigger, maybe the size of your middle finger. Now, these new illustrations have been attributed to Shalom Italia. That's the guy who did several of the beautiful Megillas that are in the exhibition. He also did a portrait, which I'll show you in a moment, of Manasseh ben Israel in 1642. The most striking difference in the replacement engraving by Shalom Italia is its deliberate replacement of that old white-bearded anthropomorphic image of God in heaven. Now, Italia substitutes a non-figurative glowing aureole like a halo where there had been a godlike figure, patriarchal kind of figure. In a recently discovered document from May 6, 1655, a 7-person council called the Ma'amad of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community expressed disapproval, and the Portuguese word is reprovado, of Manasseh's images. So they probably stipulated the creation of this replacement version of Daniel's vision and the general omission of those earlier images from Rembrandt from subsequent printings of the text of Manasseh itself. Well, we've come some distance from our starting point with the Book of Esther, and we've added several texts with Apocrypha added later than the rest of the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. Together, they provide stories about Jewish exiles living in Assyria and Persia, and, of course, about the Jewish minority community living in Rembrandt's Amsterdam. Rembrandt, like his fellow Dutch countrymen, readily sympathized with early Jewish history of a diasporic people who would be redeemed eventually through providence and through the agency of a great king, Cyrus the Great, granting them a return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple culture. In similar fashion, the Dutch Republic was founded on a shared Protestant Calvinist faith achieved only after long subjugation by distant rulers in Catholic Spain who had previously ruled the region. In the exhibition catalog, Michelle Frederick, the co-organizer from North Carolina, describes the Esther story as an allegory for the Dutch Republic, talking about tyranny and triumph with God's ultimate providence. In presenting these stories about wisdom and morality, let me show you the portrait of Manasseh by Shalom Italia, 1642. In presenting these stories about wisdom and morality, and ultimately about Jewish survival, Rembrandt's images also displayed his close reading and his fascination with these tales of the Jews in the Persian diaspora. And in turning to these less familiar biblical stories, besides the Book of Esther, he was making contact with Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, who helped him realize the special significance and the canonical controversies about the heritage around the Book of Esther for the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. Thank you for kind attention.